Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Maximizing Capacity, New Applications for Full-Time and On-Demand Hard Shoulder Running. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. First, a quick intro about the webinar host. The National Operations Center of Excellence offers resources for the transportation systems management and operations community. We have a variety of technical services such as peer exchange workshops, webinars, and ongoing assessment of best practices in the field. So feel free to browse the entire collection of NOCO resources in our Knowledge Center. I'll share the link in the chat box later. So a recorded version of this webinar along with the presentation slides will be available on our website after the webinar. For those of you just joining, welcome. We are about to start today's webinar on hard shoulder running. So a little intro about the topic of today's webinar. Nowadays, with limited funding that we have with the major road building projects, everyone's always thinking how we can maximize and squeeze more capacity out of our existing cross-sections and infrastructure, especially during peak hours along heavily congested corridors. So we saw this as a great opportunity to host a webinar and invite states who have implemented the hard shoulder running in their states. In this webinar, we will hear from Minnesota, Ohio, and Washington DOT's hard shoulder running experience, the lessons they learned, and best practices for other agencies to consider. So here's our agenda. We have Brian Carey from Minnesota DOT for the first pure state example, followed with Dave Holston of Ohio DOT. Then we'll have Barrett Hansen and Carl Westby of Washington State. At the very end, we're going to have a question and answer session, so please, if you have any questions, enter them in the questions pane here at any time during the presentation. At the end, we're going to go through those questions and read them out loud and pass it around to different panelists here to answer them. So first, we're going to share the screen over to Brian. He's going to be our first presenter here. With that, I'll turn it over to Brian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Brian Carey. I'm the Director of Traffic Operations for Minnesota Department of Transportation. I'm going to talk about our dynamic shoulder lane that we have currently in operation on I-35W. It's been in operation since 2009. So to provide just a little quick background, we have a regional transportation management center, includes traffic operations, maintenance, dispatch, and state patrol dispatch. And prior to opening up the hard shoulder, we had 400 miles of freeway management system covering in the metro area. So we're kind of building off of an existing system in an already instrumented corridor. MnPASS Express Lanes is our name for our tolling system for our hot lanes. It gives commuters a reliable travel choice. It provides carpools and motorcycles and transits the travel for free, and single occupant vehicles can use the lane if they want to pay the price at the time. So this dynamic shoulder actually ended up being an extension of our MnPASS lane that we have on that corridor. This is a map showing the existing MnPASS lanes as well as our plans for future expansion. And so the corridor that I'll be talking about today is 35W, highlighted in green in the middle of the map. And the dynamic shoulder lane section is actually the last 3 miles there on the very north end coming into downtown Minneapolis. So I-35W was our Urban Partnership Agreement project. It was our 21st century highway where we expanded our MnPASS system. At the time, we only had one MnPASS lane that was just on 394, and we wanted to expand the system to 35W. 35W only had an HOV lane on the far south end of the corridor, and then we had a major reconstruction project kind of in the middle of the corridor that was adding HOV capacity, and that capacity was going to end about 3 miles shy of downtown Minneapolis. And so as part of the Urban Partnership Agreement project, one, we were immediately converting that HOV lane to an HOT lane to make it MnPASS, just like 394, and be our second MnPASS corridor. And then we looked at smart lane technology, or using intelligent lane controls like you can see in the picture. And then we deployed our price dynamic shoulder lane. So the price dynamic shoulder lane essentially filled that last 3-mile gap that we had between the major reconstruction project and downtown Minneapolis. At the time that we deployed our dynamic shoulder lane, this was back in 2009, it was anticipated that that 3-mile section of roadway would not be fully reconstructed until sometime in the mid-2020s. That project has since actually moved up and is just starting now, but the real construction doesn't start till next spring in terms of 35W expansion. But that project, after 4.5 years, will actually put in a permanent hot lane, and the dynamic shoulder lane will end up going away. So it was always kind of intended as a temporary solution, thought to be more like 15 years. It's now more in that kind of 8-year time period, but it's suited us well, because otherwise we would have had a major bottleneck just south of downtown. In addition to the dynamic shoulder lane and some of the other elements I mentioned here, the UPA project also included a lot of transit enhancements, as you see listed out there in the slide. This is just another angle of our MnPASS lanes, as well as our active traffic management system with the lane control signals. The lane control signals were kind of an important part of 35W, but also the dynamic shoulder lane section. We have intelligent lane control signals located every half mile over every lane. There are a total of 297 of these devices that we have. We dubbed them as intelligent lane control signals because of the fact that they're actually a 4-foot by 5-foot full color matrix sign. So they really allow us a lot of flexibility to put any kind of graphic or text, and with the coloring, they give us a lot more variability than just a standard lane control signal. We use them primarily for incident management. We did have variable speeds at one time, and then we use it to designate when the price dynamic shoulder lane is open. So of the 297 lane control signals that I talk about, of the ones that are on 35W, there are about, 20 that are within the dynamic shoulder lane section. So these are some of the symbols that you would see on the ILCSs, having different arrows notifying people when the lanes are open or closed to traffic, whether it's an incident or road work. In the case of the dynamic shoulder lane, the motorist, as they're approaching, would see the merge right indication when the lane is closed, and then they would see a red X over the dynamic shoulder lane throughout the extent of the corridor there. When the dynamic shoulder lane is open, they'll actually see a green arrow. We did add variable speed limits for a time. The speed limits were advisory only. They would detect traffic flows rather downstream, and then would post a recommended speed up to 1.5 miles upstream. So like in the example in the picture here, we've got stop traffic located just downstream, so we're starting to step people down to 50 miles an hour. The next sign might say 40, and then at the next location, then that's when they actually start getting into that congested zone. We ended up turning this system off a couple of years ago now. It was in operations for about 5 years, having difficulties measuring some of the overall benefits of the system, but we were also identifying some latency issues, mainly because of some of the detection we were using. We're using single loops with some wavetronics. I think if we were to do it again, we'd probably go to full wavetronics or go to like some sort of radar sensor that would get us better and more timely speed data. So focusing a little more on the dynamic shoulder lane, as I mentioned, it was the last 3-mile segment of northbound 35W coming into downtown. So this map is a blow up of that particular area. You can see the downtown street grid on the north end there. It's also the major interchange with I-94. As you're coming north, the section that's highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the screen, that 5-lane section, that was our area that was under reconstruction, and that was a 4-year project that extended from about 2006 to 2010. where we added additional capacity and rebuilt the 35W interchange with Highway 62, and then that was adding that HOV lane that was being converted to an HOT lane. But as you can see, if we had not done this dynamic shoulder lane, we would have had a 5-lane section that was going back down to 4. But with the dynamic shoulder lane, or the PDSL here, we were able to add that additional capacity and have 5 lanes all the way into downtown. The cost of just the dynamic shoulder lane section, the section highlighted in blue, was $17 million, and that cost included rebuilding the right and left shoulders to be able to handle traffic, some additional catch basins so that we would have less ponding in the shoulders, which were now a driving lane, and also the lane control signals and the gantries within this particular stretch. This is more of a lane diagram showing the 35W price dynamic shoulder lane. So this map is a little bit tipped to the right from the previous one, where north, their direction of travel is to your right. And so as you start on the left-hand side, you can see the 5-lane section with the hot lane being the inside lane. We then have the 4 lanes plus the price dynamic shoulder lane, which is highlighted in the gray shading. We also have then on the north end, we essentially have 3 lanes that exit into downtown, and that exit actually happens on the left, and then the 2 lanes that continue on to northbound 35W on the right. The reason why that's important and why I kind of show this slide is that this is really what kind of drove why we put the dynamic shoulder on the left. One reason was we could avoid all those entrance and exit ramps that you see on the side there. We didn't have to worry about trying to have any additional striping or signing through those interchanges. So we could kind of avoid that for now, since this was the first time for doing a dynamic shoulder lane. But it really was probably driven mostly by the split there on the north end on the right-hand side of the screen, with those 3 lanes going into downtown and only going 2 to 35W. If the right lane ended up being that dynamic shoulder lane, when the dynamic shoulder was closed, it would effectively only give us 1 lane of continuity on 35W, and so we didn't want that. We felt it was better to take away from the exit into downtown, because that would only be a higher volume during peak periods, which is when the dynamic shoulder lane would be open anyway. And so this is just a typical cross-section within the area of the price dynamic shoulder lane. You can see we were able to maintain 12-foot lanes. We shifted traffic to the right, so we took everything in terms of a right shoulder, so we only have 3 feet of right shoulder, a reaction area really. We have 3 feet of reaction area to the Jersey wall on the left side, as well as a 2-foot buffer between the adjacent general purpose lane and this dynamic shoulder lane. The next image gives you a little bit better picture of how that looks. What really kind of ends up happening is we've got that buffer separation on the left with that 3 feet, and then with the yellow edge line. Then we have kind of a secondary edge line, since it's really technically the left shoulder, separating between the general purpose lane and this price dynamic shoulder lane. And that lane then, that buffer width that we would have between the general purpose and the MnPASS is really incorporated into that lane, so that 12-foot lane is really effectively a 14-foot lane. Our hours are Monday through Friday from 6 to 7. We did originally have it from 6 to 10 and 3 to 7 to focus more on the peaks, but we expanded it during the midday just because of the high traffic volumes, but we also were seeing a very high violation rate. We were seeing probably a vehicle every 4 to 5 minutes or so using the price dynamic shoulder lane when they should not have been. So we decided, rather than having a shoulder that kind of created a false sense of security for folks, it was better to just leave it open during those times, but we still shut it down in the evening and overnight hours. On the weekends, we at first had it closed, but we've gradually been expanding that, and we've expanded it to Saturday, and actually, got to update my slide, we've expanded it to Sunday recently, as well as just traffic volumes and congestion grow with special events and things going on downtown. We've seen a greater need to keep things open on the weekend as well. The reason why we have static hours and not dynamic hours is we wanted to have some kind of anticipation for the motorist to know when it would be open or closed. So even though we have static hours, we can operate it outside of these hours. Typically, the lanes are probably actually opened before 6, and they can extend past 7 if we still have congestion, or maybe there's an event downtown that would require us to keep it open until 8 or 9. And so we have kind of a dynamic nature in terms of when we open and close it, but we did want to keep it relatively static, just so that it would kind of avoid some driver confusion. The other thing we do is during snow and ice, for those in a northern climate, we actually, at the recommendation of our maintenance crews, we keep the lane open during snow and ice so that the vehicles can actually help kind of distribute the salt to break up the ice. Otherwise, the salt as it comes off the truck ends up being kind of more in clumps, and it kind of helps distribute that and keep the ice broken up. And so they feel it's a safer operations to be in than rather to let that lane freeze up and then try to open it to traffic at 6 a.m. It was better to just keep it open throughout the day and night hours. In terms of the signing, the sign over the actual dynamic shoulder reads that carpools, buses, and motorcycles and MnPASS are able to use it. So it's restricted at all hours of the day. It's actually written in state statute, because that was kind of an agreement with the city of Minneapolis that this would be an expansion of the MnPASS and that this would not be an expansion of a general purpose lane. So anytime the lane is actually open to traffic, it is still restricted to MnPASS users and carpoolers. And so that's why the signing reads as such. The shoulder use permitted on green arrow was intentionally used because we wanted it as kind of a condition that if for some reason we lost comm or power, that if the sign went blank, then technically the default would be is that we are not granting you permission, so the lane would become closed. Well, that was kind of good in theory, maybe not good in practice, because we have had some power outages due to like thunderstorms that go through the area and happen during the peak period. And so those green arrows end up disappearing. We've probably seen upwards of 60% of the traffic using the lane anyway, compared to what would normally use it on a different peak period. So this is just a couple more slides here showing what it would look like as you're approaching. So as you're in that transition zone and you're in that hot lane that's coming from the south, you would first see that the MnPASS rate would say that it's closed to downtown from that point forward, that you're told to merge right. And then before I jump here, you can see the red X off in the distance. And then as I jump closer, there's that actual red X. We initially started with some in-pavement lighting. The in-pavement lighting would actually help change the striping depending on when the lane was open or closed. So in the foreground, you can see the individual lights there, but as they kind of go off into the distance, they start to kind of blur together and form a solid line. And so as a motorist approaching it, you would see it more as a solid line, just by the close spacing of the devices. And what would end up happening was when the lane was closed, it would create this taper that would encourage people to merge right. And then when the lane was open, you can see in the center of the picture, it's a little bit faint, but the green arrow, so the red X changed to a green arrow, and those green arrows continue on through every half mile through the corridor, and the yellow line goes away, but then a white line is displayed, and it shows the white skips. So you can kind of see the 3 lights there in the foreground, that as you get further away, those 3 lights kind of blend together again and become that skip stripe. So this worked well the first year. By the second year, we were starting to see corrosion. We were seeing that the lights were actually going out, and when we went out to investigate, the seals around the lights were actually starting to allow water penetration and the salt in the wintertime, and causing some corrosion inside, so about half of them went out. We looked at replacing the system, but opted not to, because what we found was that we ended up having to turn it off, and so many of them were out anyway, that we weren't seeing a distinguishable difference in our violation rate, both with or without the lights, and so it didn't seem worth investing in the system to replace it. What we probably would have done differently if we had is we found that some of the devices that were actually sealed more than what the manufacturer recommended. Those were the ones that actually survived better, so we probably would have done more sealant. We probably also would have looked at maybe doing more of a conduit system to run the cabling for power and comm as opposed to saw cutting it in. Then it would have been less susceptible to just the movement of the pavement, but also would have allowed us to run new cabling, and that was kind of a challenge in that there wasn't enough additional slack that if we wanted to reestablish the connections due to the corrosion, there wasn't enough slack built into the cabling to allow for that. We would have had to have run all new cabling, and so we opted not to deploy it again. As far as the structures and the pull-offs, this is true of the entire corridor, not just on the dynamic shoulder, but we built this type of protection for the sign structure, which also helps protect the cabinets as well. And it also created a 60-foot maintenance pull-off area, which you can see the SUV park there. It's about a 60 by 10-foot pad, and the maintenance vehicle is able to kind of pull behind that and then ends up getting protected from traffic by the barrier that's protecting the sign structure. Some of the sites where we had room, we actually extended that maintenance pad to 200 feet to allow for emergency refuge area for stalls and crashes and such. And then we do have an area within the PDSL section that 200 feet we extended to 800 feet. I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit. Here's a little bit more on the design. We have catwalk structures that allow us to be able to maintain the devices overhead. And so the signs themselves will actually pivot. And if you look on the left hand of that sign that's displaying the yellow arrow, you can see the hinges, and that sign will pivot like a door and flip backwards so that a user or a maintenance worker can work on the front of the sign from that catwalk structure. That also helped during some of our testing in that when we first installed them, we installed them backwards, and then we could test them without them visible to traffic because they were facing away from traffic. So I'm going to wrap up here with just some lessons learned and what we were going to carry forward into another project that we developed but never actually constructed. We looked at a dynamic shoulder lane on 494, and this was going to be a 5-mile stretch. It was going to be a right-handed dynamic shoulder lane, so we were actually going to be going through interchanges. And at the end of the day, it was determined that this alternative did not win out against doing the full reconstruction of the third lane in each direction. And so that was actually constructed over the 15 and 16 construction season as a full new lane. But had we done the dynamic shoulder lane, the things we would have done different from 35W, we looked at doing a dynamic insert within the static sign as opposed to having that individual lane control signal underneath to help kind of reduce costs and have it be more of a lane control signal as opposed to the dynamic message board. We were going to only display those over the shoulder only, so not having the lane control over each general purpose lane, and probably just doing more of like a cantilevered structure as opposed to the larger sign bridge, so in an effort to kind of reduce costs. We also looked at having more advanced notification, and so we would have on this corridor, it would have been an exit-only lane that would be extending up onto the dynamic shoulder, and so we would have a dynamic portion underneath the static sign that indicates the exit, and then showing either exit only or blanking out entirely to show when the lane was either open or closed. So this would have been 1 mile away, and as you got closer, this was a half a mile away. We would add an additional sign that would say shoulder use at Highway 55 and whether it was closed or permitted. And then at the actual point where the shoulder lane was going to start, or just shy of, we would have this sign that again would give that indication that the shoulder use was permitted, and whether or not you would either have to exit only or it was just a standard exit. And we really focused more on more advanced warnings, so you can kind of see we scaled back in terms of the number of signs within the actual dynamic shoulder lane, but wanted to have a lot more advanced notification to give people warning that there was a change ahead. And we were also looking at some watch for traffic on shoulder signs as well for traffic that would be entering from the ramps. And so with that, in closing, as far as dynamic shoulder lanes go, we have nothing planned. 494 didn't happen, as I said. Got constructed as a full lane, but it's still a tool in the toolbox. And then 35W, the dynamic shoulder lane, will actually end up getting replaced with a permanent lane starting in 2018 and opening up in 2022. And we're actually starting to look at our smart lane system, actually doing some removals over the next couple of years because of the high cost to operate and maintain the system. And we've had some issues where the manufacturer went out of business, and so we have no warranty and limited spare parts. So we're actually looking at replacing the system with more frequent dynamic message signs rather than doing the intelligent lane control signals over each lane. So with that, that's the end of my presentation, so I will pass it on to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'll hand it over to our next presenter, Dave Holston from Ohio DOT.
Thank you very much. Let me just get in presentation mode here real quick. Okay, you seeing it all right?
Actually, yeah, it's okay now.
Okay, very good. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for your time. My name's Dave Holstein. I'm with ODOT, Office of Roadway Engineering, and I'm here to talk about Ohio's first hard shoulder running project. We've dubbed it the Smart Lane, so if you see that term in some of the slides, Smart Lane equals hard shoulder running. It's on I-670, essentially from downtown Columbus out to 270, the outer belt, past our airport through the east side. Let me change. There we go. So how did we get here? A couple of years ago, Ohio did a statewide ATDM study, and we essentially looked at every corridor throughout the state, looking at a number of strategies, these being the strategies that were explicitly looked at, and in the end was a report that assigned, based on benefit cost, what strategy would work best for each corridor. We decided that, one of the things that we really wanted to try that we hadn't is hard shoulder running, and we boiled it down to one of 4 corridors. 3 of them are on the left in Columbus, and the one on the right is in Cincinnati, on the outer belt around Cincinnati. We ultimately picked the 670 corridor for a couple reasons. The first one was the physical cross-section was quite wide. We had a lot of room to work. But more importantly, maybe, was the traffic characteristics. So this is a congestion scan, and what it shows is congestion on 670 eastbound is very, very much focused to just a 2-hour period from 4 to 6 p.m. So the other 22 hours of the day, everything's fine. It's just during those 2 hours that we needed the additional capacity. So we thought that hard shoulder running would be a very good application here. On top of that, you can see on the left where the hard shoulder running corridor is, but it was dumping into 270. Now we have an existing problem on 270 with a weave, as you see on the right. So we made a decision that we had to fix the weave anyway. So we've actually bundled it into one project, and we think it's going to make the hard shoulder running actually much better. The system essentially is going to be 9 full matrix signs on gantries across the road. We went with full matrix signs because we thought that gave us a little more flexibility for using the gantries in the hours that we weren't running the hard shoulder running. This is our typical section. On the left is we also are using the inside shoulder for the same reasons as Minnesota. We didn't want the hard shoulder running lane to have to interact with the ramps on and off. So we put it on the left-hand side, and it actually worked out pretty well with our existing typical section. Some of the challenges, we had to shift the lanes a little bit in part of the corridor. We had a 12-foot shoulder on the right-hand side. We took 2 feet of that away, and this was the resulting lane width. And what's nice about this is we still have our minimum 4 feet offset to the median barrier on the left, but we still are able to provide a shoulder for emergency pull-offs and for access for emergency vehicles on the right. So the wide existing cross-section really worked out for us. One of the big design challenges is the little inset. You can see there that there is some curvature on this road, and when the shoulder in the super elevated sections is actually adverse to the super elevation, so we have to do a correction. If we're going to have vehicles now running on the shoulder, we've got to get them super elevated in the same plane as the remaining lanes. So that was one of the design challenges. We also had to add 16 inlets for drainage purposes. But one of the biggest challenges was trying to figure out how to get out of the HSR lane. It's pretty easy to get into, but getting out really required some thought. Here's our costs. From a HSR standpoint, it's about $13.5 million. The top cost of $35 million was to get rid of the weave problem that we were going to have to fix anyway. The $3.5 million for bridges is completely unrelated to the hard shoulder running, but there are several mainline bridges that needed rehabilitation within the planning horizon of this project, so we just incorporated into it. So the grand total is $52 million, but the reality is only about $13.5 million are related to the hard shoulder running directly. Now, we also did a very quick cost estimate of what it would have taken had we done a traditional widening, adding another 12-foot lane, adding another 10-foot shoulder. And the delta between our hard shoulder running project and that was about $25 million. What's nice about that is we're able to provide the capacity only in those hours when we need it, 4 to 6 p.m., and then the other 22 hours of the day, we still have a shoulder on the left-hand side. So we think it's a very economical thing, saving that $25 million, being able to meet the capacity demands, but then also 22 hours of the day, we're also to provide the emergency refuge on the left-hand shoulder. The modeled travel time savings is 33 to 45%. By keeping everything in the median, we avoid all the interchanges, but we also keep from pushing our footprint out and avoiding neighborhood and impacts to the numerous interchanges throughout the project area. The other really beneficial thing is the HSR project didn't start design until early this year, and it's scheduled to be filed in February of 2018. So basically a one-year time frame from when we decided to start design until the time that the plans are filed. So we could deliver this project much faster and address the congestion issues that we have out on 670. So this is talking about how we're getting out of it. So that area with the yellow box sort of represents where originally the hard shoulder running lane would have tapered out and merged back into mainline 670. What we decided to do was, since we were rebuilding the interchange, we essentially built a small additional lane represented by that green arrow, and now the hard shoulder running lane will actually terminate into its own lane. And this is actually the location of the last overhead gantry showing people if the shoulder lane is open or closed or not. So if you're in one of the right-hand lanes, when you get to this location, if the hard shoulder running's closed, then you can move over into the new lane. Obviously, if the lane is open, then you need to stay in your current lane. Public involvement has been quite extensive. This is new to Ohio, and well, it's not that common anywhere. So we've got a lot of public involvement with the local officials, our transit agency, which is currently using the shoulder for bus-only shoulder use. We have our NEPA public involvement. And one of the other things we've been working with a lot is enforcement, as well as emergency response, because they obviously have some concerns about losing access to the left-hand shoulder for the 2 hours during the operation. A little bit about how we think we're going to be operating the system. Opening up, we have a dedicated freeway service patrol who will do a physical inspection of the shoulder, as well as we've installed additional cameras that will provide us 100% video coverage of the hard shoulder running lane. We are using variable speed limits. One of the things is it kind of reconciles the geometrics of what we have out there with the speed limit when it's open. So we are going to use variable speed limits. VSL is fairly new to Ohio. We just received enabling legislation within the last year, so this is sort of the policy, not only for the hard shoulder running lane, but for other variable speed limit installations around the state. Maintenance is a big concern. Columbus does get snow, not as much as Minnesota certainly, but it is an issue. So we've been working with our county to come up with a plan to handle snow and ice. And essentially, if we can't get the lane treated and open and keep it operationally safe, then on those days we just won't open it. And you know, really, in the few times that may happen, essentially we're just back to the same situation we're in now. We have the same number of lanes that we do today. Law enforcement, as I said before, a lot of coordination, a lot of concern from them. But also not only from just access, but from their ability to enforce with the variable speed limits specifically. So we're being very careful to make sure that we log all of the speed limits as they go into effect for purposes of ticket enforcement. Right now we're planning on just operating it from essentially 3:30 to 6 o'clock. Like Minnesota, if the conditions warrant it, we may open it up a little bit earlier, may close it a little bit later. But the thought was, as a new thing to Ohio, we wanted to keep it as close to fixed time as we could for driver expectation. Not having operated one of these facilities, we're planning on dedicating a full-time traffic TMC operator to the operation of this to work with, ensure that it works. That we may scale that back, but you know, that's just one of those things that you kind of learn through time is how much resources this is going to take in our traffic management center. And that's pretty much it. Ohio's first HSR lane, or smart lane, will go to construction this summer. We have an interim completion date. We should start operation either the end of middle of next year or fall of next year, probably more likely. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thank you very much, Dave. Our next two presenters are Barrett Hansen and Carl Wesley from Washington State. So now I'm gonna turn it over to them for the rest of the presentation.
Hi, thank you. Let me get this up. So my name is Barrett Hansen. I'm a design manager on the 405 corridor and was the project manager for the design for our 405 PQ shoulder. And then Carl Westby is with me as well, and he is the traffic analysis manager for the 405 corridor. So we wanted to kind of set the setting of what 405 is for those that aren't familiar with kind of the Puget Sound region up in Seattle. So 405-167 is about a 40-mile freight and commuter corridor. That's essentially the north-south alternative to I-5 that goes through Seattle. And it's one of the most congested routes of the state and has some of the largest and fastest growing population centers in the greater Seattle area. Back in 2015, kind of on the north half of the corridor, we implemented an express toll lane system that was partly a two-lane express toll lane system, and part of it was a single-lane express toll lane system. And when we opened it, basically we had the two-lane express toll lane system. That was some additional capacity that was added as part of the project. And so after opening, what happened, and the challenge that kind of created the need for the PQ shoulder, was we added that capacity kind of going northbound on the south half of the project, and more traffic was getting up to the very north part of the corridor faster, which caused some increased congestion levels. And specifically kind of at the last interchange going northbound, it was a very high volume interchange where we had about 1,000 vehicles an hour entering the freeway, and where before the toll lane project that had the capacity where they could find their gaps reasonably well, after the toll lanes and after we had more traffic flowing up the area, those lanes were basically full, so they had no gaps to find and created some of the congestion that we saw afterwards, in which we needed to find, hey, what's the solution for us? So I'm looking at the traffic conditions, and we can have a traffic heat map here to show. This was before the PQ shoulder lane was implemented, and you can see we had upwards of almost 7 miles of congestion going northbound in the afternoon commute. And this was building from that on-ramp at the, what we call the SR 527 interchange, which was at about 1,000 vehicles an hour. And so there was a very much, once the toll lane project was open, a very quick desire to what can we do to try and solve this additional congestion before we basically move that bottleneck further north. So what we settled on was for looking at what can we get out there the fastest, most effective way to address that challenge, and we decided on was implementing a PQ shoulder. So we ended up converting the right shoulder of an almost 2-mile section on the very north end of the corridor between 527 and I-5 into a dynamically controlled general purpose PQ shoulder lane. So there were some previously planned PQ shoulder lanes in the Puget Sound region, but none had been actually implemented at that time. So this ended up being the first PQ shoulder lane that WSDOT implemented. So kind of during the development of that, of the project, it required an extensive amount of stakeholder outreach, being the first and just kind of setting, all right, these are the criteria and what we need to implement. So that involvement included a lot of coordination with State Patrol and also kind of the WSDOT signal maintenance and looking at the refuge areas and the maintenance pullouts of providing them options of saying, hey, we can add this much impervious area. What's the best place to locate these? How do we coordinate the emergency pull-offs where maintenance needs are so we can get the most effective use of that any of the pavement that we added? Also coordinating with internally within the WSDOT traffic and tolling divisions of setting, all right, this is what the design of the system and the concept of operations are going to be and how it's going to operate. And also coordinating with how do we build the system and also maintain the express tolling system operating at all times. Then working with federal highways and the local cities, and with federal highways trying to develop for doing the highway safety manual analysis on the project, and how do we analyze this as a PQ shoulder, and looking at for determining what the right cross-section was going to be. And I'd say one of the main and most important ones was the coordination with the traveling public. And that kind of was on multiple fronts. One, since this was the first PQ shoulder lane, trying to set the expectations of what is a PQ shoulder lane, how it would work, and then also what to expect once we open the system from a traffic perspective. And I'd say a lot of the benefits of that you can see in the top right corner was just an easy visualization that we made to try and explain that was used in different social media, blog posts and on Twitter, as well as being able to provide that kind of visualizations to media that allowed them to write an easy story that the public could understand and help paint the picture for the public of what to expect and how the system would operate. And then finally with the elected officials, this is a very high profile project that we ended up having. In one part of the gubernatorial debates it was brought up, and then also having the governor there for some of the early project events, and then actually with the one to press the button to turn the system on the very first day. And where we ended up with was a project cost that ended up being about $11.5 million total. It was all funded by the toll revenue. Now that it was a little over $7.25 million of an actual contract amount as part of a design-build contract. So what we ended up building for the element. So in developing the system, we ended up doing 4 overhead signs. So it ended up being about a half-mile spacing between the signs. And we ended up to match kind of other corridors had some ATM systems. And so that was consistent with the ATM system spacing as well as going with a 5x5 lane control sign. And we located them so generally you can always see it, and when you're traveling in the shoulder, you can generally always see a sign as you're traveling through to see is the shoulder open or closed. One other thing that we added was, and you can kind of see on the side of the GIF running there, is adding a supplemental message on the side so we could add additional cue warning, supplement when the shoulder is open and closed, and convey some additional messages to the traveling public. Finally, we did end up with basically 4 of the emergency pullouts, and those were coordinated generally around some access points for the express toll lanes, but then also at the different PQ shoulder lane control signs to allow maintenance and opportunity to pull off and maintain them while the PQ shoulder was up and operating. As part of the project, we also ended up building about a 1/4 mile long noise wall that was determined to be needed when we went through the NEPA process. For striping and delineators, we ended up not doing a second edge stripe. We started out when we opened the project with just the single edge stripe between the outside general purpose lane and the PQ shoulder lane. After opening and monitoring some of the traffic, there was a couple spot locations that we ended up going and supplementing with an edge line in one corner where we're seeing some cars kind of drifting a little bit to the outside, and then where we start, basically some of the guardrail terminals we're starting just to try and provide some added delineation for the traveling public to see when there's something on the outside condition coming up. For the typical section that we ended up with, generally was an 8-foot inside shoulder. We had an 11-foot express toll lane with a 2-foot buffer, 11-foot general purpose lanes, and then a 13-foot outside PQ shoulder. For the project cost, as I said before, it was about a total of $11.5 million. For the breakdown, since it was a design build, it was a lump sum contract amount, but looking through some of their price-loaded schedules, generally about $3 million of the contract was for the PQ shoulder elements, for the actual electronics, for some of the paving, for the emergency pullouts, for the striping and those elements. The noise wall ended up being a little less than $2 million. There's about $1 million of some other express toll lane adjustments that were done in other parts of the corridor that weren't related to the PQ shoulder. And then another $1.5 million for the actual design builder design and the design builder administration costs. For the timeline, as I mentioned before, it was a very high profile and everyone wanted to get congestion relief out to the public as soon as possible. So the project was identified in March of 2016. That's when the legislator said, go do this project. And we actually opened the project a little over 14 months later at the end of April in 2017. So in the first 9 months, or first 6 months, we went from identification, worked through what the concept of operations, and developed the design build RFP. We awarded the contract at the end of the year. They started construction in January, and they were open to traffic 120 days later. So I'm going to let Carl talk a little bit about what we saw from a traffic perspective once we opened the system.
Okay, so Barrett led in with this heat map you see on the left in the before condition where we had a pretty obvious bottleneck at 527 interchange, that 1,000 vehicles an hour entering a essentially full freeway facility, creating that bottleneck. About 2 o'clock to 7 o'clock, pretty recurring every day, we had that congestion and that breakdown. After we opened up the PQ shoulder lane, immediate relief, day one. The heat map you see on the right shows the general purpose lanes in that after condition and really cleaned up many, many miles of bottleneck and congestion. Still have a little bit of congestion out there. This is not an uncongested corridor by any means, but it was a pretty dramatic improvement. If you look at the very top of the after condition, you can see that yellow section there. We did move a little bit of a bottleneck downstream. That was expected, and at some point the lanes end and you run into an interchange. So we were facilitating some traffic moving to that a little quicker, but all in all, pretty big performance benefits in the general purpose lanes. If we look at the express toll lane on the left side of the buffer there in the same area, we had some congestion in the before condition that was in and around an access point, and then also related to really slow performing GP lanes. In the after condition with those general purpose lanes moving a lot better, we saw the express tolling performance tick up to essentially free flow speeds all the time. Talk a little bit about travel times here in the general purpose lanes. So if we're looking at about a 7-mile stretch here up in the northern part of that corridor, what you see here in the dotted line is the before condition of our travel time over the PM peak period. In the gray bandwidth, that shows you kind of that 5 to 95th percentile, what the distributions were. So a fair amount of variability occurs, but that average showed quite a long travel time. The blue line down below shows the after condition. We cut the travel time in roughly half and moved up to near free flow conditions with just a small amount of congestion occurring. This chart on the screen here, slide 12, shows kind of week over week for the first several months what the volume and usage of that peak use shoulder lane was. Week one, we had kind of limited use over this 5-hour period. By week 2 and definitely week 3, we had full use. Very, very quick adoption. People figured it out and started using it. A lot of that, I think, is related to the good outreach we did in advance. We had a lot of television coverage in addition to the social media stuff that Barrett talked about. Since then, there's a lot of variability in traffic day to day, but the use of that lane is pretty consistent and been pretty high. Incidents, we took a look at the incidents over the first 5 months of operations, and we had 11 incidents. We looked at them in detail. We had 4 collisions, 6 disabled vehicles. 1 was unclassified, and really, as with all crash analysis, it's hard to make any determinations or identify any trends on such a small sample period. But we didn't see anything that really stood out. This is consistent with generally kind of what we're seeing in the corridor. I will note that when we did have incidents, when we closed the lane, the red X is up. We told people to move out. We had really good compliance. And so we felt very good about that, in that this was the first dynamic shoulder lane that we had in Washington State. It was something new, but the compliance was very good when we did have to close it.
We're going to talk a little bit maybe about some of the feedback that we got. And when we turned it on, as part of the bit of some of the early outreach too, is we did get some early great feedback that people were really appreciative of the congestion relief. You can see some of the Twitter messages, and then also just in some of the comment sections of different blogs and outreach of people very happy when they could take 10 minutes off for their commute when they're traveling home to go to their kids' soccer match or just get home to their families. So it was a very positive approach. And looking at the future, there are some other PQ shoulder lane projects planned in the corridor. It's a tool in the toolbox. It's not in the kind of right solution for every location. But at very kind of select locations, it can be a great tool to utilize. And you see a couple of them are further north on the I-5 corridor, and then in another part of the 405 corridor where we plan to implement them kind of more on the 2019 time frame. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned of some things from the design perspective, as well as just the implementation and outreach perspective. Looking back on it, one thing I had mentioned earlier was about the added delineation, that after we opened the system, we did go back and add in some additional delineation. I think not having the second edge check out there has helped with some of those, I guess, off-peak time and the compliance with that. If it doesn't look like a lane, it just looks like a normal shoulder. But being smart about where we added the delineation, where we needed it around some guardrail terminals, and then just some curves where people were kind of doing off-tracking that we didn't want them to do. And as we mentioned a couple times, that early stakeholder coordination was definitely key to the timeline that we got out there and the success of how we opened it. And involving everyone early on, including kind of the maintenance and state patrol, working through to set the criteria for the project, and giving them options of, for an enforcement area, is it better to have 3 smaller pullouts strategically located, or 2 slightly bigger ones where we could fit, both options within the environmental footprint, and just giving them the option of saying, hey, what works best with them, I think helped gain that support from those different agencies as well. And then from an implementation and outreach, again, the public outreach of educating the traveling public, of doing some of the visualizations and the renderings to make sure that when it was easy to, a picture, says 1,000 words, for having the traveling public understand it, but then also for the earned media and having newspapers and television stations pick it up and have something that they could put on, a picture to put into the website to help with just the words, so they're not trying to explain it in text. And then also explaining to the public what the expectations were after we opened the system, that this wasn't going to solve every problem in the corridor, but in understanding what the after conditions were going to be, so there wasn't a surprise after we opened it. When we did the opening, one other thing that we did was looking at supplementing some of the incident response teams and the enforcement. So for the first 2 weeks after opening, when the PQ shoulder lane was operating, we had some additional incident response teams that were ready in case there was something blocking the lane to handle any incidents in the corridor. And then when the shoulder was closed, we were coordinated with State Patrol to have them out there to try and do some enforcement and education so we didn't get the violation. So when the red X is up, to make sure people were properly driving, not in the shoulder, but in the general purpose lanes. And the finally part of the, I guess, downside of the clear communication and the message for the public expectations was there's been some feedback of, well, why can't you do this different locations, and why can't we just open it 5 minutes early or 10 minutes early, and trying to understand there's more than just flipping a switch that goes into operating a PQ shoulder lane, that the Traffic Management Center is monitoring the whole Puget Sound region and not just this 2 miles of 405, and that there's a process that we have to go through to make sure that the lane is clear, the shoulder is clear of debris, and then it's ready to open. So that was kind of our presentation, and I think we've had very successful kind of opening and implementation of the first PQ shoulder.
Thank you very much, Barrett and Carl. I really appreciate it. So with 3 very interesting presentations, now we'll move on to Q&A. We have some interesting questions in here. First, let's start with this one. What is one question is, what is the nature of variable speed limits which has been clubbed with the dynamic shoulder lane? Is it dynamic when the shoulders are open, or is this something that's fixed? I'm assuming this question mostly goes to Brian, but if anyone has any other comments, they're more than welcome to share their thoughts on this.
Well, I apologize. I had somebody come into the office here. If somebody wants to answer the question, that's fine.
So I can answer for Ohio.
Go ahead.
Primarily, the variable nature of it is it's going to, every day that it's open, we're going to lower the speed limit. Like I said before, it's more to match up the operating speeds with the geometrics that we're putting out there. However, our overall variable speed limit policy can be implemented based on prevailing conditions. So in Ohio, it's a bit of both, but primarily every day that the hard shoulder running lane is open, we are going to lower the speed limit, and so it's variable from that point of view, but we are keeping the possibility of varying it for other reasons based on condition.
And as far as Minnesota goes, the variable speed limits are really just as more of a cue warning type system. It's just warning of traffic congestion downstream. So we do not actually lower the speed limit on the corridor when the dynamic shoulder lane is open. It's posted 55, and that's just how we operated at all times.
This is Carl from out here in Washington State. We don't have the dynamic speed, but I will share that when we open that lane, we do see aggressive drivers passing on the right and some very high speeds in that PQ shoulder lane. We haven't had any incidents as a result, but we were a little bit surprised to see people passing on the right, passing sometimes free flow conditions, so you're at the 70+ mile an hour range for people using that lane. It appears to have settled down a little bit in that it's pretty well understood and we get even distribution of traffic across all the lanes, but we were surprised at some of the high speeds and the passing that occurred in the PQ shoulder lane.
Thank you. So another question that we have here is that What have been the benefits and consequences of having a hard shoulder running on the safety and crashes?
From Washington, we haven't seen anything that's really stood out from a safety standpoint. We did do, as Barrett mentioned, HSM safety analysis, working with FHWA to look at what the anticipated crash experience would be. It indicated the same or slightly less crashes would be expected. A large part of that is because of the congestion reduction that's resulted in this. We did have a fair amount of congestion-related crashes historically in this area. But to date, it's still early. We have not seen any new crash experiences that are atypical for a corridor like this.
In Ohio, it's very much the same. We did the HSM analysis going into it. We're not predicting any kind of major increase at all in serious injury or fatal type crashes. And then also, we think that from a congestion-related crash standpoint, it's going to be a net very large benefit in terms of safety.
For Minnesota, we had a major reconstruction project to the south that was really opening up probably one of the worst bottlenecks in the metro. And so that was dumping a lot more traffic volume and congestion into the particular area. And so we were then trying to, help mitigate that congestion by building this dynamic shoulder lane. However, we still have congestion as we come into downtown, and as the 35W lanes, the two that were on the right, continue onto I-94. And so we get a lot of congestion in the rightmost lanes, but not so much in the left side, including the dynamic shoulder lane. So overall, within that stretch of the dynamic shoulder, we did actually see crashes go up, but it's not anything that would not be unexpected because of the change in congestion and traffic volumes on the corridor because of opening up that bottleneck upstream. And a lot of those crashes are really occurring in those rightmost lanes because of the congestion going into the 94 Commons, and not really because of the geometrics or the design of the dynamic shoulder lane itself. We see very few crashes in the actual shoulder lane.
Thanks. Another question that I see here is that somebody is asking if you needed to get environmental clearance to add the hard shoulder to the existing facility due to the increase in the capacity.
And I guess this is from, excuse me, so that, yes, we did. We ended up going through a categorical exclusion for the NEPA documentation and then had to run the noise analysis, and where we ended up with the noise wall because it met the reasonable and feasible requirements. And then the same for the Environmental Endangered Species Act and all the other environmental clearances.
Same for Ohio.
And same for MnPASS.
Thanks on that. So somebody is asking if do you use dynamic or variable message boards to support the hard shoulder usage, and if so, what are the messages that works best for you?
So up in Washington, we do have, so at every lane control sign, there's a supplemental side-mounted variable message sign to supplement the message. So the standard ones of anytime there's a green arrow, it'll say shoulder open to traffic. When it's the red X and the shoulder is closed, it'll say do not drive on shoulder. And then if we get a cautionary or for the key warning, it'll have a message of heavy traffic ahead. And then we just have another just basically toolbox of different standard messages depending on incidents, different maintenance crews out there, other conditions that we expected that we define in the concept of operations.
In Ohio, we're planning on using the full matrix across all lanes. So we've got quite a bit of flexibility as it relates to the gantries controlling the hard shoulder running itself, but we don't plan on using supplementary variable message signs. We do have between each gantry a static sign that reinforces that the shoulder lane is only open when the green arrow is displayed.
For Minnesota on 35W, we just have the lane control signals. There's really not any other additional signing other than that static sign that gives them permission when the green arrow is activated. Prior to the section of dynamic shoulder, we do just have a large overhead message sign just to give indication of any incidents. But otherwise, it's blank, whether the shoulder lane is open or not. That was kind of one of the things we'd probably look at doing more of if we had built the 494, as you saw in my kind of wrap-up slides there. We did look at probably doing more advanced warning signs with larger dynamic message boards as you enter into the corridor.
Thank you. We have two questions related to emergency responders. So the first one is, how much is the minimum time that it takes to empty the shoulder lanes in case of emergency? And also we have somebody else asking, have you experienced any difficulties with emergency responder access to the incident scenes when the HSR lanes are open? Or are your roadways wide enough to have no impact on these operations?
I would say that for Minnesota. Sorry, I was going to say for Minnesota that we haven't really seen much of an issue with emergency response. The responders are able to get to the scene basically by kind of splitting traffic. A lot of times, as I said, most of the crashes are occurring more on kind of the rightmost lanes, and with the shoulder on the left side. A lot of times the incident is not on the shoulder itself, and so oftentimes we won't even close the shoulder to traffic just because that particular lane is not getting impacted. But traffic or emergency vehicles are usually able to kind of work their way up to the scene just by splitting traffic in general. When we have closed it, we've never actually measured like the minimum time to kind of empty out the shoulder lane. It does seem like people follow the arrows pretty quickly when they know that there's an incident ahead and will start to vacate. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll get everybody getting out of that lane right away, but that lane will at least start to flow better. So I don't really have a specific time, I guess, to give to that.
I would just echo what you just said from Washington's perspective.
Yeah, in Ohio, ours isn't built yet, so I can't tell you how long it's going to take to empty out. But we are fortunate enough to have a full right shoulder, so we're not anticipating response being too big of an issue.
Thanks. Another question here. For right-sided shoulder running, how do you handle the reduced merge distance? Do you have any recommendation on addressing the perceived safety concern from the reduced merge distance?
So I'll say from Washington, ours is really just functions almost like an auxiliary lane. So it starts as an add from an on-ramp, and then it terminates where it feeds into an existing auxiliary lane that is added to support the next interchange. So we don't have any intermediate ramps. We did coordinate just a little bit up on when we started of having basically a dashed line so that when it's at the start of the very first PQ shoulder sign, to direct people of when it's off to merge in just like a normal parallel on-ramp, and then when it's open they can drive across it.
Yeah, for Minnesota, we didn't go through our interchanges. That's why we put it on the left. But as we were developing 494, we were planning on going to interchanges. And in fact, I've got a diagram here. If I could share my screen, I could probably even bring it up. We developed a concept that we kind of stole from Virginia, and then of course had to tweak it a little bit for our own needs, just like every probably DOT does. But we basically created a kind of a parallel acceleration lane for the on-ramp, and then the striping would allow them to have enough acceleration distance before they got on that dynamic shoulder lane when it was open to traffic. When it was closed to traffic, they would then have to do kind of like a double move, where they would almost have to move twice over. That corridor we had a lot of room to work with, so it was able to provide that that distance in that acceleration lane, but that probably wouldn't be the case on a lot of these areas. That would be looking at dynamic shoulder lanes where we're trying to squeeze things into a very tight right of way.
Thanks. Another question here. So what is the projected number of years the facility operates under the free flow conditions before traffic starts to fill in?
I'd say that's going to really depend on your corridor. In our case, we had that major reconstruction project to the south that opened up a bottleneck, and we would have had a lot more congestion had we not built the dynamic shoulder lane. But I mean, we had congestion on day one, and we knew we'd have congestion on day one, but it was substantially less than what we could have ended up having if we hadn't built this dynamic shoulder lane before that reconstruction project was finished.
Yeah, as part of Ohio's project. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
So as part of Ohio's project, like as I mentioned, we actually rebuilt, did some work on the systems interchange at the end of our hard shoulder running where it ties into the outer belt. So everything within our project meets our full 20-year design. So there are no plans to do any other further expansions. And to the best of our ability to predict traffic growth, it should last 20 years.
Yeah, and in Washington, similar situation. You know, we're anticipating that this is out there for a long period of time, many years. Just like any general purpose lane, you are at the mercy a little bit of just general traffic conditions and traffic growth. So what we've seen as we project traffic volumes ahead and have done our modeling is over time, as we get increased growth, the benefit starts to diminish a little bit. For us, it's that downstream terminus where we have a system interchange that starts to fail and, you know, results in some backups, but we're still seeing a lot of benefit of keeping it, and it's, even in that condition, much better than the no-build alternative that we were faced with prior to building this.
Yeah, I think from a general point of view, just to build on what the other speakers are saying, you know, going out there, even if it's not the ideal solution, it is a solution to make the current conditions better for, even if it's not 20 years. It's Ohio's point of view. It's better to do something affordable now and start realizing some benefits than waiting for the perfect, air quotes, solution and the funding to become available. Because with the way our budgets are, that could be a very, very long time. So even if it weren't to last for 20 years, we would see this as a great improvement over the existing condition, and that wouldn't cause us any hesitation to go forward with the project.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I was also going to add too, like in our case, we had a major reconstruction project in one area, but this particular area wasn't going to happen for another 15 years, and so ours was kind of to bridge that gap of the 15 years. So we always knew it was going to be relatively temporary, but I would still consider it as an alternative in even more of a 15 to 20 year type solution.
Thanks. The questions keep coming. We have a few more minutes before our cutoff time, which is 2:30. So I'm going to ask a few more questions now. So somebody asked about the nature of detection techniques related to speed, and if you're using a proactive versus a reactive approach for that.
Assuming that's for me in Minnesota. We are using a combination of single loops as well as wavetronic sensors. I think we would probably look at doing either all wavetronics or doing some sort of radar sensor that would give us improved speed detection rather than relying so much on the loops. And so that's what we were starting to look at in terms of revamping our variable speed limit system. It was more of a reactive system. It would be looking at downstream congestion and would activate based on that those downstream conditions. And I think what we were kind of finding is we weren't seeing a whole lot of changes in terms of improved throughput or improvements in safety. We do have very aggressive ramp metering and very close interchange spacing. So I think for us, the ramp metering probably was already squeezing out as much capacity as we could get out of the system, and so that's probably where we weren't seeing as much with the variable speed limit system. As far as trying to expand the system further or trying to revitalize it, I think the fact that we've been having some maintenance issues with the vendor that went out of business for our message boards, we're kind of scaling back from the active traffic management system because of the issues that we faced with having such high maintenance operations costs with the ATM system.
Thanks, Brian. One more question for you for Minnesota DOT. Is there concern from FHWA with expanding the use of the shoulder to most of the day instead of just a few hours as it pertains to not meeting the geometric standards?
Yeah, there was definitely a concern. We worked with our local office to discuss alternatives, and I think they agreed that with the amount of violation rates we were getting in that midday, that we didn't want to create kind of a false sense of security for folks. And then we, once we opened it, we continued to monitor it to make sure that we weren't having any safety concerns, and we really weren't seeing any problem of like increased crashes during the midday, because most of the crashes we've been experiencing on the corridor are more related to congestion.
So a more general question related to that would be, have you ever opened the shoulder use during off time for incidents? This could be for any of the three panelists.
So I'm not sure if they have yet, but it's definitely designed where they can do that, and it's another tool to respond to incidents.
And for Minnesota, yes, we have for both incidents as well as special events.
In Ohio, we don't have ours yet, but we're certainly on planning opening up as necessary based on conditions. We would plan on being fixed time for the most part, but we will use it when necessary based on the circumstances.
And do you guys consider refuge areas for law enforcement or incidents in these hard shoulder runnings?
So up in Washington, we ended up with three that we added that were relatively short, were about 100 feet long. And then we actually ended up having one, this existing extra pavement out there that was about a quarter mile long. So we did it within the confines of what we could do and still meet the timeline for our environmental clearance.
Kind of similar for Minnesota, we have 3 sites. 2 of them are probably just around 200 feet long, and then we've got the third one is about 800 feet long, just because we had the space available, and plus it's right prior to that 94 interchange where we knew we would probably have a higher frequency of crashes. So we put out what we could.
Okay, thanks. One more question for you guys. So was there a design variation or exception or a FHWA approval that was needed for a 3-foot shoulder?
So I'll say in Washington, we did have a design deviation process for 11-foot lanes and then to use the PQ shoulder just for the configuration we had.
Yeah, and likewise for Minnesota.
Yeah, Ohio also had some design exceptions, and we used the HSM analysis to support our decision.
So thank you so much. I think that's it for the question part of the session. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and I also want to thank our panelists. We had some good information here. So again, a recorded version of this webinar along with the presentation slides will be available on our Knowledge Center within 24 to 48 hours. On behalf of the National Operations Center of Excellence and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.